Supposed Bible contradiction. Did the women tell no one of Jesus' resurrection, or go and tell the disciples? The Gospel of Mark says that on the day of the resurrection, the women went to the tomb and found it empty. But after one of the angels reported that Jesus rose from the dead, Mark says, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." The rest of Mark has been shown to be a later addition, so on the surface, it sounds like Mark contradicts the other Gospels, which all report the women went and told the disciples. However, internal evidence within Mark's Gospel can shed some light on what is being said here. For starters, Mark 16:8 may not have been the original ending. Clayton Croy lists 87 scholars who think there was a longer ending to Mark that was lost. A later scribe added the longer ending that...
What do you mean? Meaning that Mark, the author of Mark, actually written something longer, but it is gone? What did he say?
7 scholars who think there was a longer ending to Mark that was lost. A later scribe added the longer ending that we have in an attempt to fill in the missing ending of Mark. Many scholars theorize, in the original ending, the women did actually go and tell the disciples, like what we read in the other Gospels. Scholars like James Dunn and Richard Bauckham suggest it must be assumed the women eventually told what had happened. Otherwise, Mark would not have known about it to write it down.
Okay, this is interesting because this is relating to some of the previous video where some of the Christian actually commented on how the author got the story, right? Because I asked, do we know which woman that is the primary source that actually is in the event that tell who and who told the author, right? And I have discussed some of your comments in the previous video, or is it in the upcoming, depend on how I arrange my uploading schedule. Yeah, but that is interesting because this video implies there must be a chain of narration that is unknown. That is interesting, and I have discussed in other video comparing that to hadith, because in this case it will be like hadith da'if at best, because we do not know, well, is it da'if or da'if jiddan if we don't even know the narration, right, or chain of narration.
Assume the women eventually told what had happened. Otherwise, Mark would ending that we have in an attempt to fill in the missing ending of Mark. Many scholars theorize, in the original ending, the women did actually go and tell the disciples, like what we read in the other Gospels. Scholars like James Dunn and Richard Bauckham suggest it must be assumed the women eventually told what had happened.
So that's interesting wording, right? It must be assumed that the woman told others, right? So to me, that, of course, I understand that given that these are historical texts, not holy book, not like divine revelation, right? It's you know, so we theorize what happened in the past based on what we have. So there's a lot of assumption that have to be made. So that's quite normal, right? But of course, if you compare, that's why in terms of you know, direct comparison with hadith or even Quran, that's why this question, especially from Muslim, keep coming up, right? Because we do not see, because the Quran is not a historical text, right? It is a divine revelation. So that's why the way we take it is very serious. But if the Bible is just like any other historical text, yeah, we have to make assumptions, etc., to make sense of what is going on. That's normal. Right?
Otherwise, Mark would not have known about it to write it down. However,
but one of the comment previously says that, which is interesting to me, that he said that Jesus actually himself, after resurrected, goes to the author. So that's interesting. I have never heard of that before, and I have mentioned what I thought about this in the other video.
However, setting this theory aside, there is still internal evidence within Mark that can support the notion the phrase in Mark 16:8 doesn't mean the women literally told no one ever. Mike Lacona and Dale Allison highlight Mark 1:44, where Jesus heals a leper, and then Jesus says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded, for a proof to them." Jesus tells a man to tell no one on his way to perform a religious task. Likewise, the same thing might be happening in Mark 16. The women are given a task by the angel and told no one on their way to tell the disciples. Lycona notes the phrase in Mark 1:44 is similar to the phrase describing the women telling no one. Thus, Mark
How is it the same when one is instruction, one is statement of what happened? Right? Well, how is it the same? Except if you want to play with linguistics, etc. But because when say, see that you say nothing to anyone, that is a format of instruction, right? So even if you say such instruction means within the scope, blah blah blah, but still blah blah blah. But when another segment says they said nothing to anyone, that's not instruction wording. That's statement of what happened, right? So I'm not sure.
Mark might not be saying that the women told literally no one, but told no one on the way to bring the message to the disciples. Dale Allison says that this is...
But he said that the assumption that the angels say something, etc. That's assumption, right?
Quite plausible. Just as 144 means say nothing to anyone except the priest, so 16:8 may well mean the women said nothing to anyone except his disciples. In accord with this, Matthew clearly read Mark so that the message entrusted to the women gets to the men without noticeable delay. Richard Bauckham also draws nothing to anyone except his disciples. In accord with this, Matthew clearly read Mark so that the message entrusted to the women gets to the men without noticeable delay.
What does this mean? Matthew clearly read Mark so that the message entrusted to the woman gets to the men without noticeable delay. What does that mean? Does it mean that when Matthew is writing what he want to write, he already read Mark and rewrite the story based on his assumption? Is that what it means?
Richard Bauckham also draws a parallel to 2 Corinthians 12:4, where Paul states he received divine revelation, but he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Likewise in Mark 9, after the transfiguration, Jesus tells the disciples to tell no one what had happened until after the resurrection. There seems to be a running theme that some divine revelation and miracles were meant to be kept temporarily secret. It may well be that the women take the words of the young man to be an apocalyptic secret that they are to communicate to Jesus' disciples, but that is strictly not to be revealed to anyone else. That the time for proclaiming the risen Christ to the world will not come until he appears to the disciples in Galilee. There is no suggestion in any of the Gospels that any of the disciples, women or men, communicate the news of the resurrection outside the circle of the disciples until the risen Lord explicitly commissions them to do so. I am inclined to think this is the most convincing explanation of the women's silence in Mark 16:8. Now some might object to this interpretation, because Mark 16:8 says the women didn't tell anyone because they were afraid, not because they were urgently trying to get to the disciples. In Mark 1:44, the healed man was told to tell no one so he could get to the priest. So it is not a perfect parallel. However, Mark often uses fear as the expected response to an epiphany. The whole of verse 8 is essentially describing their reaction as awe-inspired. We see similar language in other places throughout his gospel. In Mark 4:41, he describes the disciples as afraid after witnessing Jesus calm a storm on the sea. In Mark 5:33, the woman with the issue of blood comes to Jesus with fear and trembling after she was healed. In Mark 9, when the disciples experience the transfiguration, Mark says, "And Peter said to Jesus, 'Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified."
Is he saying that in the way Mark write, fear, trembling, etc. is not actual fear, not actually terrified, but it's more of, I don't know, something else, but somehow that those words are used when there's no real fear. I don't know. What does it mean?
This probably refers more to amazement. The way Peter speaks doesn't seem to suggest fear of Elijah and Moses. Also, to help support this interpretation, in Mark 16:8, Mark says the women were astonished. The only other time this word is used in Mark is when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, and Mark says they were overcome with amazement. The other term we translate as trembling is often used to mean one ought to be obedient to instructions. So given this context, what Mark...
So meaning that is this the issue of translation? Meaning that they say the original language is translated in one way when it's actually normally or should be translated otherwise? Is that the case, or Or what? Because I'm not sure.
16:8 likely refers to is the women did not tell anyone on their way to deliver the message to the disciples. Some might argue that another problem is Mark doesn't mention any appearances of Jesus after the tomb is found empty, which some use to argue that Mark didn't believe Jesus was physically resurrected. But Mark mentions Jesus' resurrection multiple times. He also says Jesus will meet the disciples in Galilee in 2 places. Mark didn't necessarily need to narrate the appearances given the cultural context. Craig Keener says, "It is clear that ancient writers could predict events never recounted in their narratives, but that the reader would understand to be fulfilled in the story world. The Greek East's favorite work, the Iliad, could predict without recounting the fall of Troy, which was already known to the Iliad's tradition and which it reinforced through both subtle allusions and explicit statements in the story. The book ends with Hector's burial, but because the book emphasized that Hector was Troy's last adequate defender, this conclusion certainly implies the tragic demise of Troy. The Odyssey predicts, but does not narrate, Odysseus' final trial. But in view of the other fulfillments in the story, the reader or hearer is not left with discomfort. The Argonautica will not directly address Medea's unpleasant saying of Peleus, yet hints at the tradition. Likewise, that Mark probably ends without resurrection appearances hardly means that Mark wanted his readers to doubt that they occurred."
That's interesting, right? Because all of this, meaning they have to try to rationalize and make sense of the author's style, because there's a relation with other authors that have certain narrative that they want to put across, and certain writing styles, etc., 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 right? So all of these factors, I guess this is what would make it very interesting to study, right? Because there's so much human factor in the gospel, just like any other books, right? Because it's basically simply just like any other books. That's why the discussion here seems very parallel to any other writing style, authors, blah blah blah, right? It's something new for me because the hadith and the Quran is unlike human authorship, right? So it's very different.
Even Gerd Ludemann says, "The tradition that Peter and the disciples will see Jesus is backed by the report in 1 Corinthians 15:5. This means that the historical kernel of Mark 16:1-8 is an appearance of the risen one to Peter and the other disciples. Therefore, given the internal evidence of Mark and the cultural context, Mark 16:8 probably doesn't refer to the women refusing to ever tell anyone what they experienced. A more reasonable interpretation can be found by comparing this passage to other places in Mark and the rest of the New Testament, which is that the women didn't tell anyone on their way to deliver the message to the disciples. Thus, this supposed contradiction can be resolved."
In terms of, if you say academic discussion, right, the wording used is quite interesting, right? Because it can be resolved. It doesn't say it is resolved, right? So from academic perspective, I think that's good in the sense that it doesn't overclaim. It doesn't say that this contradiction is definitely has been resolved. It says that it can be resolved, it could be resolved, it may be resolved, because those are possibilities of factors that you can bring in to see that this is resolved in this way. It doesn't say that this have been conclusively resolved, etc., right? So academic wise, it's interesting, especially from an academic. Of course, as usual, I would reiterate that to put my faith into something as such, that's a totally different story, right? Because there are things that I like to study as an academic, but to say that I'm trusting this kind of thing for my salvation, that's why I'm taking. That's why when we discuss about hadith, the Quran, we want the sure thing. We do not want to put our safety in the hereafter on assumptions, theory, etc., right? Well, anyway, thank you for watching. Has been interesting, and we'll see you next time.